go ahead and get started. I lost how to change the mic, so hopefully I'm loud enough. So I'm Ron Williams, and this is Docker for Drupal theme development. Can you still hear me all right? Okay. So this presentation started from a BOF earlier this year at DrupalCon. And so I set up a BOF, and in my previous experience, especially like entity API discussions and BOFs at DrupalCon, normally, maybe 10, 15 people show up and you have a really good intimate conversation for Drupal. For Docker, about 80 or 90 people showed up, and that made a very interesting BOF at DrupalCon. But basically, there was a lot of interest, and so I worked with Ben Hosmer earlier this year to put together a presentation and then take that presentation to Drupal GovCon. So that was about 2 weeks ago, presented down in DC. And this is the, I guess, fourth iteration. Ben's presented it a couple times, I've presented it a couple times, and then we've done one together. So this is using Docker for theme development. So just by a show of hands, how many people have used Docker before? Have you installed boot to Docker? Okay. And who's familiar with containerization and those tools like maybe LXC containers, which is a precursor for Docker? Okay, great. So this is probably a really good session for people who are newer to Docker because I'll go through what Docker is, why you should use it, and then also talk about the concepts of theming, because it's really hard to know how to use Docker for theming if you don't really know how to use Docker for anything. So this is a little bit about me. I started the Maryland Drupal group in 2007 and organized that until about 2012 when I went to work for University of Colorado Boulder. I now work at USDA, Department of Agriculture. There's a group called Enterprise Application Services, and we provide services and application development work for both USDA but also other government organizations through interagency agreements. So we'll talk about, within this presentation, using Docker, background on Docker, how to use Docker, introduction to containers, and then how to actually do theme development within a container. So probably have, especially being that this is a theme conference, there's probably a lot of people familiar with doing SAS compilation, using Yeoman tools. So I'll talk about using those within containers, especially when you're doing cross-platform development, supporting Windows developers as well. So why do you want to use Docker? It's pretty darn cool. The company has a really large valuation at this point. They've gotten quite a bit of VC funding in the last 2 years. So they were worth about $500 million at the beginning of the year, and now they're worth close to $1 billion, which is quite a big growth. I'm sure whoever was there early is quite happy. Microsoft is actually has made some moves so that people have wondered if they're going to look at purchasing Docker, because you can actually run Linux on Windows and have it work pretty well, especially with the dev tools. Oh goodness, why is it doing those transitions? So benefits of the container. When you're looking at the cost of deploying Drupal or any application to a system, there's a lot of cost to getting a reliable environment running. So do you know if your system is going to, does it work on the developer's machine, or does it work on the test machine, and then is the production machine set up the same way? So with Docker, because you're sharing basically because you're sharing this container, which also includes your application, then you know how it's going to work on that production system most of the time. Configuration management is included. So one benefit, especially on the labor side, is if you have a new developer who maybe isn't familiar with Human or SaaS or setting up a local dev environment at all, you can provide them the container or the image with who's familiar with Vagrant? Okay, so lots of Vagrant users here. So Docker, the Docker project that I've been working on that's Drupal specific for USDA, that came about as part of a natural progression from using Vagrant for Drupal development, which is one of the popular Vagrant tools or Vagrant chef configurations, to using Docker. So I took a lot of the best practices, lessons learned from the Vagrant Drupal development project, which is drupal.org/project/VDD, and then moved that into a Docker container and configured that out. So try to get the best of both worlds with using what Vagrant can provide with the default configuration, but Boot to Docker does a lot of that setup for you now. So when you're onboarding a new developer, passing a single image that's already been pre-compiled is a lot easier and faster than, having them do a Vagrant provision themselves. And then you're, of course, build once, use everywhere, which is Java's kind of claim to fame, but it actually runs quickly. So unlike Java, you're not passing around this monolithic core. It's really just a small container on top of a shared kernel. So difference between VMs, which is what Vagrant uses, versus Docker being a container. VMs are like trucks. They're not stateless. You can change them once you've started them, but moving that change back into configuration management or code is difficult. So you have to remember, what changes did I make to my VM? And so a sysadmin, they might set up a new machine, load a bunch of services, use something like Salt or Chef to configure the machine, and then you can't move and recreate that environment again without rebuilding from the ground up or moving a very large machine image around. And then as the applications get larger, you want to handle more traffic, or you have a different environment. You may not want to run 6 or 8 virtual machines. A Redis instance, a Apache instance, a PHP FPM instance, MySQL instance, a Solr instance. Like those could all be virtual machines. That takes a lot of space on your local machine. Docker lets you do that. So. Who's heard of Rocket, the competitor to Docker? Okay, so good. This won't confuse too many. So Docker works similar to Rocket. So it's quick, it's purpose-built, and you can launch your application. There is a competitor called Rocket. It's made by the CoreOS group. They've been contributing to Docker. It's not clear with the long-term where Rocket will end up. So I would consider still looking at Docker for containerization, especially since it's a lot more mature. Containers are not new. They're rooted in LXC. If you go back to older versions of Linux, you can set up C groups and manually configure your containers. Docker didn't invent containers, but they make it really easy to provision the system components required to run a container. So if you need to plumb networking to the container, you're simply opening a port, and that's defined in the run command. And we'll talk about what those commands look like. Docker started as a system by .cloud, which is the precursor service that Docker actually created to run multiple language hosting. So not just running PHP on a shared server, not just running Ruby on a shared server, but allowing Ruby and PHP to coexist on the same system without having any impacts on performance. So leveraging Docker, there's tools called Project Atomic, Shipyard. Those are, sorry, it's transitioning. Okay, So with containers, difference between virtual machines generally is you're going to run a variety of services within the virtual machine, whereas containers are going to be a single application within a container. So if you start, say, a SAS compiler within your virtual machine, you might also have an Apache service as well. With containers, you'll only run, say, a SAS compiler in one container and also an Apache, another container that would run your Apache server. So I'll try to get through a little bit of the LAMP stack quickly because I really want to get to the theme development pieces. So when you're working with containers for a LAMP stack, you would have a PHP web server and a database container. And so I currently run a stack just like this. There's arguments whether you should move PHP, FPM, and all of these other tools outside to additional containers. But to have a cohesive, similar structure to our production web environment, we have a shared server. So we're having all of those services together and then a separate database. So this allows us to run two systems independently on the local dev, just like we do on production. So sure. So in the case of USDA, we have two primary operating systems we're using on production. We used RHEL 6 and are moving to RHEL 7 for the Docker hosts. And then for local dev, as well as our IaaS OpenStack environment, we're primarily running Ubuntu systems. There's also a fork from Ubuntu called Docker Base Image, and we're moving our container right now. It's open source. So does Docker run on top of Linux OS? It does. It's a service of. It's an additional service that you would install on top. So it's available for pretty much any major distribution of Linux, and you can also build it from source as well. There's also in the tools slide, which didn't seem to load, there's a tool called Boot to Docker, and that is actually a Vagrant-based provisioner for the Boot to Docker image. So it's two parts, the application on your Mac or your PC, as well as the image that hosts a Docker instance for you. So there's not native Docker support on the Mac, but you can, just by installing another program, get support for Docker on your Mac. And what's nice about that is, especially at USDA, we have limitations, especially with government machines, what they'll allow us to run on it. So if we can get a policy exception for Docker, which took about 4 months, we can actually run other tools inside of the containers and inside of the virtual machines, and then have development resources available on the Windows environment as well. So using Docker, generally you'll be exposed to these commands. Build creates an image. So unless you're building your own Docker image from a Docker file or extending an existing image, you probably won't use Docker build that much. Also, there's Docker Hub, which is a continuous build and deployment tool for Docker. So if you open source your Docker file, you can just have Docker Hub build that for you. It saves probably about 20 minutes, and then all you have to do is download. Docker Run is how you start your container. So if you have your Yeoman container or your Apache container that has also the dev environment with SAS, you start the container that way. And the Docker Run command is only used one time for each container that you're starting up. So once you've ran the container, if you didn't configure it the right way, you would generally just remove the container and then just create another container. So all of your data generally will reside on the host machine. So there are shared folders between, just like with the Vagrant-based development environments, there are shared containers or shared file system between those. So anytime you remove your existing container and then start another one, it can just pick up those same files that you had interacting with the system before. So Docker start and stop, that's very similar to Vagrant start and stop, though it's abstracted because on the Mac, Boot to Docker is a virtual machine, same with on the PC. So you need to start the boot to Docker virtual machine and then shut it down depending on whether you want that machine to keep running. Otherwise, it just kind of chews up your battery. And you can see if you look inside of if you've done some troubleshooting with Vagrant, if you go into VirtualBox, you'll see, oh, my machine is running, and you can just shut it off there. So Docker start and stop are really specific to the containers. They don't control anything outside of the container, and you'll use those same commands when you're maybe moving onto a dev system. So Docker logs, just pulling log information out in a standard manner, and then Docker inspect gives you some metadata on the container, so you can see is this container connected to another one? Is there port mapping for those containers? Just kind of how that's working. So the Docker file is the build commands for a container. So just like you have the chef configuration, the Docker file is the build out of your image. And so this is just a piece of the Docker file. Some people would move these run commands together, but that's very semantic. But if you're familiar with system administration, you can see it's very common commands to get this created. So I won't go into Docker build beyond what I already have, and then Docker run. What I will show is how fast you can start a service, and hopefully this video will play. So this is listing the services that have started, and then you're starting the dev and database containers. So if you've done Vagrant up, it probably takes a bit longer than that. But this, if I was to connect on port 80 to the boot to Docker IP address, I would then have a running server at that point. So shared volumes, again, you have a container. Within the container, you're binding to a local document root or a local shared folder. Same with MySQL data. It's a little different from Vagrant because most of the time with Vagrant environments, you're not sharing your database file system with the local machine. In the case of Docker, you want to share that because then you can turn off the container and then restart the container later. So if you want to open up connectivity between these containers, you're using secured socket connection between the containers. So you have to specifically you would start the database and then specifically define within the run command for the web server that you want it to have access to the database container. If you don't do that, then you won't be able to see your database server, which kind of breaks the point of Drupal unless you're running databases some other way. So using other containers is as simple as Docker pull, Docker push, so you can maintain updates to your container, and instead of using a Docker file, you can push the image back to Docker Hub without building out the container. And so there's a bunch of official repositories that you can pull from. If you're using Ubuntu, I'd definitely look at the Linux base image or something like that. If you do some search, it basically makes Ubuntu run better within a container. Ubuntu in the next version, so 17.04 or something like that, will have better container support, and it still works really well. It's just that there are some issues with standard in, standard out, and managing logs. So, okay, that's a lot of information on dev, but why do you want this for theming? So if you've compiled SAS and then you have another developer who's working on that same series of files or same SAS files, it's always easy to get the SAS file uploaded into the Git repository, but there are constant merge conflicts with compiled SAS. So avoiding those merge conflicts, letting the staging or test server actually manage the final compilation of your CSS is possible with Docker. And then you can, with Windows development, especially in my use case, is to get Docker approved in government systems or maybe highly secured systems. So if you work in the healthcare industry or insurance industry, that can be a common issue, and even running Drupal on Windows web servers can come up, which is kind of difficult. So also the software version incompatibilities. Go ahead.
Just back up a step. When you merge conflict,
yep.
I mean, that's just the point that you should commit your SAS and not commit your CSS.
Right. That would be the recommended approach, but there are lots of cases where people will check in the compiled SAS or the compiled CSS, and that way they aren't doing later builds before deployment.
So Docker somehow stop them from committing their CSS?
No, you would change your development and deployment workflow to make sure that CSS is not included, and then use Docker to actually either perform a final commit or during your continuous integration build process, compile the CSS and push that to production, but just keep that out of the Git repository. Version incompatibilities is mostly eliminating those problems where somebody says, oh, it works on my dev machine, but it's not working on production for whatever reason. That doesn't apply as much with front end, but it definitely happens, of course, in different ways. Unfortunately, Docker doesn't fix users having different browsers, so sorry, that's still going to be there. So to start out, here's how you would set up a dev environment for theming. So I currently have these two images uploaded. One is my MySQL container, and the other one is my Linux Apache PHP container. And so if you go to Twitter, my handle is Ron_Williams. I have a link to these slides as well as links to these open source software, and then I'll reference one more Docker container that's called Solarsis Yeoman, and that's the other container that I use within this presentation for building out the theme. So I'm focusing on Aurora for theme development. That's what I'm most familiar with. I've definitely there's more than that, and Yeoman, the Drupal install library has like Zen and Omega and Aurora and a couple others. So Docker PS is the command that I just ran. I have these two containers that exist, and then I'm going to go ahead and run the Solarsis Yeoman container. So I have Docker run, and then I'm saying that this directory, the user's Ron Williams www, is going to map to the home directory within that Yeoman container. And so you can set this this first path to whatever makes sense for you. So you may have it in like documents www, but feel free to modify that. For home Yeoman www, this is very specific to this container, so if you use a different one, you may want to map it to another directory. For example, with my lap Docker container, that has a document root of var www. So when I run that container, I use this first part of the path, and then the colon, and then var www in that case. So I have an interactive terminal that I'm starting, and then defining the container. So what immediately happens when I hit return is I'm logged into that container as the Yeoman user, and that's the behavior of that container. Go ahead.
Is this basically the equivalent of running a vagrant and then attestation into your vagrant process that we're doing is mapping your local directory to...
I'm sorry, speak up just a little bit.
Oh, sorry. Geez, I don't normally get that. I was asking, is this basically the equivalent of in vagrant SSHing into your directory? You basically map one directory to the other and you put files in one thing. Are you using another?
So I'm mapping the local host OS directory to be available within the container. So if I didn't have this this flag for the mount, the files on my Mac would not be available within the container. So this would be like using the shared file system within Vagrant. Yeah. So if I was to ls, and I think I might even have a demonstration of that. Great. So you can see that the www directory is now mounted within the UMN home directory. You're accessing bash within the container, so it's a little bit different than, say, SSHing into VirtualBox or, yeah, a VirtualBox vagrant-based instance. So with boot to Docker, you're actually already SSH'd into the virtual machine, but then you're executing a bash command inside of the container. It's just a little bit of a nuance and difference between those two use cases, but most of the time you're not going to notice a difference. It's just instead of SSH or vagrant SSH, you'll have boot to Docker SSH, and then you're executing into the container that you want to use. Otherwise, you know, it's not really easy to manage those containers, especially if you were to put them in different VMs. So what I did next is actually detach from that container that was running. So there's a couple commands that are shortcut keys. So Control P, Control Q, and that gets you out of the container. And then you can see I run the same Docker PS command that I ran at the beginning of this process, and now I have this UMN container that's running. So the only thing it does is it has an instance of bash running, as well as having the software, the UMN software inside of that. So in reality, I could actually extend the lap Docker container to have all of the UMN functionality. But with the way that containers work, separating services, keeping things as modular as possible with system administration, you can just add this service to your development stack without having to figure out how all of these components work together. So next thing that I'm doing is going back into the container. And so if you notice, I'm getting another interactive terminal. This number 98 will vary based on your use case. So if you see I have a container ID of 98A and it continues endlessly, or like 120 characters or something, but you only need the first few characters in order to execute bash or a command. It gets interesting as well. If you're running the lap Docker container or an Apache instance, you could actually exec into that container and run like Apache or Apache 2, and you'll get lots of weird output that Apache processes requests for Drupal. Sometimes it is useful to see what the stream is actually returning, though. So anyway, with the UMN, back into that container, just like we were originally, I just wanted to show that the container remains on the system and running once you exit out of that bash environment. And then I navigate to my sites directory. So you might have 3 or 4 sites within this www directory. And so I go into themes and then install the generator Drupal theme. That's the name I couldn't remember earlier. So if you go to the Aurora theme page, it will tell you to install UMN and the generator Drupal theme. You don't actually need to do that because you have UMN installed. And maybe what would be a good use case is to extend the Solarsis UMN container to actually be like a Drupal container, so you don't have to do this install after setup. So you have to elevate your access. So you see the sudo su minus. So now you're running as root. Do perform the install, and then exit out of de-escalate your rights. So you're back as the UMN user. And next you go through the standard UMN theme setup. So and then Drupal theme, select the theme, the base theme that you want to use, the sub theme that you want to use, and then UMN will complete the setup and configuration of the theme. So after you've set up the theme through UMN within this container, we don't need to go back and perform further action with UMN. So we don't need to have this service available within the main development container because we're only doing it once, maybe per site. So we'll exit out of the UMN container and then switch over to the dev container. So if you see now, earlier we had gone into the UMN container by executing into 98. Now we're going to this BBC container, which is the lap Docker instance. So there's also, for this lap Docker container, basically think about that as your standard Apache server. We have open sourced that container, so if you have interest in just testing it out, there's also documentation on GitHub pages that will guide you through the first time setup of a Docker container. So if you've never worked with Docker, it'd probably take about an hour to go through all of the documentation, but there's both Windows specific and Mac specific information on using Docker. And you'll basically go from a system that doesn't have any local dev to a system that has a local dev environment capable of running a Drupal site, and then UMN would be added on at the end. So
that documentation you're talking about, that's on the USDA GitHub site?
Yes, yes. So there should be docs and then Mac documentation or Windows documentation, and then there's a getting started guide. Definitely welcome feedback and any comments on that documentation as well.
Another kind of follow-on question: would you say that the average themer would go through the documentation themselves, or do you think it's more likely to be like their office kind of DevOps person setting them up and then off they go?
You know, I think it varies. If the command line doesn't scare you, which, you know, if you're using UMN or something like that, you're probably comfortable enough that you could get through the documentation. The most difficult part of both Vagrant and boot to Docker is getting all of the ports configured. But because boot to Docker out of the box handles the shared directories, handles the setup of the virtual machine, you're really only dealing with Docker specific commands. It'd be great if you have a DevOps person in the office to assist. And I'm also working on some video documentation. So we have a few other groups within USDA who want to use who want to use this as well. And then we've made some connections with the 18F group, which is a task force from the president for basically modernizing government services and government websites. So really pushing on that to actually use more modern tools like this. So I think it's consumable. We have 3 theme developers that currently work for USDA within our department. 2 of them were able to get self-started without any issues. I think one had like one feedback recommendation, and then the other needed a little more hand-holding, but I think it's worth giving a try, especially if you are interested in learning Docker or even some system administration experience. So yeah, so we've back to the to this. Logged into the Apache container and then switched over to our theme directory that we just created within the UMN container. So we're basically mounting the same file system within the UMN container as the Apache container. So if you think about that in a traditional sense, it might be like an NFS mount that 2 servers are looking at. And then we're performing the standard gem install bundler. So this is probably a process that you've done quite a bit with theme development to get either SAS installed or get the compiler available. So you have the gem file that now exists after performing the LS after doing the bundle install. And there's one problem with the container and the way that Ubuntu runs within the containers. And this is why I mentioned using the base Linux image instead of the Ubuntu standard image. Basically, the locale that's used it's using POSIX. So it doesn't handle special characters like an ampersand very well. So if you have an ampersand colon and then a pseudo element or an attribute, it does not compile the SAS correctly. So you may have ran into the same problem, but basically what we do is see what's available within the container. And if you were to download this container, you would have exactly what you see here. Export, just basically change the change from POSIX to CUTF-8, and then your SAS will compile correctly. This is a bug in our container, and we could put this in a run command. It's just that I've been out of the office for a month because I was presenting. This is the third session in a month, so that will be in the next version of the container. So then bundle exec and then compass watch, forcing and polling. And so when you're changing your SAS files, your CSS files are then getting compiled. And that's, of course, for your local dev, hopefully not checking them in, using these same SAS compiler container on your staging environment with Jenkins CI to do that final SAS compilation. But, of course, for testing locally, you definitely want to have that available. And then, so I just simulated a modification to the style file. I added something like a body tag in there, which probably wasn't the best, but it demonstrated that the files are readable and then can get updated throughout your theme development. And so that's what I have today. It's my information. If you have any questions on using any of the containers or want to see a little bit more, I do plan to have the video documentation out for setting up the Mac-based local dev environment as well as the PC-based local dev environment, which will include the theme development specific work as well. So if you're interested in that and want to see a step-by-step setup of Docker as well as boot to Docker, then follow on Twitter, and I'll probably have that in the next 2 weeks or so. So thank you. Are there any additional questions? Sure.
It seems to me that one possible annoyance of using containers rather than a single VM is that you seem to be frequently logging into one, logging out, logging into the other, logging out. And I wonder if it would be possible to automate that with Bash script, Ansible, other.
So there's a tool called Docker Compose, and then which will, instead of having to perform the Docker run. So earlier in the process, while we were setting up Yeoman, I had to run Docker run, but I already had these other two containers set up. So Docker Compose will actually trigger the setup of all of the containers with one command. So that saves a bit of time on the front end, not having to, did I remember to connect the containers together, or did I set up my shared folder, which is the primary issue with using a system that isn't using one monolithic virtual machine. There is a command that Docker has released, and I cannot remember it, but it basically lets you map it's like Docker and then a command or a reference to that container, and then you can run a command inside of the container using Bash without having to actually exec into that container and run the process directly. It's definitely there definitely could be a little bit better usability between those. There is a tool called Kitematic that allows you to keep all of these containers open, so it'll actually provide you with a already executed process within the container. So you can just click on that single container, and that will bring you to Bash. And then you can keep those in maybe separate windows, and that way you're not constantly bouncing back and forth between those. But yeah, I could definitely see that being a use case, and I wouldn't be surprised, especially with the Docker engine improvements that are coming out, as well as Docker Swarm, which is basically managing multiple engines, that it would be possible to directly execute or attach process to a process within a container at some point. Thanks. Yeah.
This question is admittedly a little loaded. It seems to me that there's an advantage of using containers because they're lightweight, they're easy to set up and tear down, and everyone here is like developing on a Mac. So we need to run a VM just so that we can run Docker, and it feels to me a little lame, like if I'm throwing this all away because we still have to just kind of put the VM anyway.
Right.
Does it feel the same to you, or is it really totally transparent? Is there essentially like
I think
in a shared folder in the VM, then using like the shared maps to the document?
well, it's no different. Well, let me rephrase that. I don't see it as adding an additional layer compared to already running Vagrant. I see containers. Containers are considered services, and they're generally running only a small component. So if you already have to set up through Vagrant a virtual machine that is this monolithic system with a large number of services that are provisioned and installed, then especially once Docker Compose matures, where you can set up these individual containers very quickly and with literally one command, I think the benefits will become clearer. So if you've worked with Vagrant, installing your entire stack and you have MySQL within that container or within that virtual machine, there are cases where you want all of your modifications that you've made to Apache, maybe to improving PHP INI. There's a lot of cases where the theme developers on our team don't really have as much experience, especially when we were using Vagrant, to want to modify the chef files. Like they go onto Google and they find, oh, if I run this command or edit this single file within the VM, I can fix whatever's wrong. And so, they don't want to spend another hour fixing the chef files, the root cause. They might send that off to the DevOps administrator, or they make the change one time and their system works from then on. I think that that's you would want to keep Apache, but there are many times where you want to get rid of, say, the MySQL server, and so you end up having to uninstall and purge or rebuild that entire virtual machine and then reapply that fix that you've already found previously. With Docker, if you have an instance of a MySQL database that you want to keep, then you can leave that and use a shared mount. There are some cases where you want to import data just temporarily to a MySQL database, and I do this quite a bit when I know, I'm adding an index to a table that's managed by core, and I should never do this, but maybe it will improve performance, so I want to see if this actually works. Then being able to spin up a container really quickly and import my MySQL database, run some Drupal, make some changes to the database, and then run Drupal against this new test database. I know I'll never use that again, and working for USDA or even some larger for-profit sites, a 7 or 10 gig database within that container, you just want to get rid of all of the corrupt associated with it. So you can run the container, have the container started, and then just delete the container and all of the data is gone at that point. But you still have your original MySQL database running.
In real life, does it actually work to share containers around different developers on the same project?
So I think that's confusing how the containers work maybe a little bit. Because the container, you would share the Docker file, and that would be leveraged by anyone on the team. And that's similar to sharing your Vagrant file with all the chef provisioning processes or definitions. So you would generally not export a container and then move that to another virtual machine. It would be committing any changes to the application or to the container and then pushing that up to Docker Hub or a private Docker repository, if that's how you want to handle it. But in the case...
When you say pushing that up to
So I'm sorry. You would be pushing either, if you're updating the container specifically, which is more of the OS, the fundamental pieces that are running or supporting Drupal, that would be pushed up to Docker Hub. And then you would still maintain your separate Git repository, which is your normal Drupal whether it's CSS or the Drupal core files. So you're pulling the container. Each time you're creating a container, you're creating your own instance of that container as well as the source code, just like running multiple instances of Vagrant across multiple team members.
I'm still not sure what the answer to that question is. So what you are sharing on Docker Hub is the Docker file,
which is the image.
To the Vagrant file.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So yes, you can, with a Vagrant file, however, once you've provisioned your virtual machine, you can share that virtual machine with another team member. So it may be 4 or 5 gigs that you're transferring across the network to another team member, but you could do that. With containers, because of how they're running, I guess you could move the entire boot to Docker VM, but that would be pretty expensive to send that file. I wouldn't go that route.
Do you mind if I just confirm then what I've understood?
Yeah.
All right. So what I think I've understood then is I'm in effect, as a member of a team, sharing any changes that I make to my configuration. And then if someone wants their machine to match mine, which everybody should,
Yes.
we're all good. And so if they're already running it, they'll grab the config that I've pushed to our repository.
Okay.
Correct? We're saving our config in the repository.
So you would pull the latest version of that image that was updated. Yeah.
And when you say version of an image, you mean the config file?
So the config file gets converted into an image. I could show a basically Docker build that is building the image from the Docker file. So you would be pulling that compiled image basically. Yeah.
I'm still confused.
Lots of pieces.
So the Docker file.
Is there a whiteboard here? Maybe I could draw it out.
The Docker file.
Yes.
You run Docker build against the Docker file.
Yes.
That creates an image.
Yes.
The image gets pushed up into some shared space.
Yes.
With other members on your team.
Yes.
They pull down that image.
Yes.
And they Docker start it.
You would actually perform a Docker run. So if you have an existing container, so let's just say I updated my lap Docker container. The push happened. This image is now in Docker Hub in the cloud. And then you pull down the latest version of that image. You would stop your existing container and then run a new container. And that's how you would get the latest version. So you can have a newer version of the image without actually running the image. You can keep your existing containers going if you have a use case for that.
How big are the built images that share? Not 4 or 5 gigs.
No. Because the kernel is shared, you're not actually including the entire kernel. And when you see the build process, only certain components are being included within that. With the Docker file that we have, this is about 350 megabytes that is downloaded for the container.
So it's like the net result of this.
Yes.
Apache compare.
Yes. Yes.
So obviously this is the Docker file.
This is the Docker file. There's a little more down.
That's got to go in a repo too, right?
Yes. Yeah. So if you go to the GitHub IO or GitHub pages for the project, we have the Git repository, which holds the Docker file. And then there's Docker Hub, which links to our GitHub directory and then pulls over that Docker file continuously and then builds the Docker file for us. So that saves a lot of time because I could build the image on my local machine and push that up, or I can just push, a 15 kilobyte file up to GitHub and say, Docker Hub, have fun, build that 500, build that 300 megabyte file. But it actually takes more, and the reason that images get used is because each time I have a run command, it performs a series of operations that are built upon. So In order to build this locally, I'd probably be pulling down 1 to 1.5 gigs of files before the build process actually completes. And so I don't have to do that. It just gets compressed and sent, built, and all of the layers are applied, and then that gets compressed by Docker Hub, and that's what you can then download later. Oh, a lot of moving pieces for Docker.
Okay, so reality then.
Yeah.
Does it work for teams?
It does. It does. We have 4. I guess we're at 6 now, but 4 that are actively using it because we just hired 2 more back-end developers, and then the 3 front-end theme developers that are using the container for like day-to-day, every day they're using it for their local dev. And then
like multiple projects or a single complex project, or?
So it varies. We have some longer running projects with GSA, especially operations and maintenance projects, and then we have just 3-month sprint development projects as well. I would say on a monthly basis, I'm a DevOps administrator, so I touch probably more than the developers are. I probably am performing either updates or maintenance or security changes to about 10 to 15 sites. And I would say on average, the developers are maybe using, if it's larger projects, maybe three sites they'll be working on at once, and then up to 6, I would say. So it's definitely used across multiple sites, multiple projects.
So adoption is hard, but once you
I think it is adoption is hard. It's just that initial learning curve, picking up a lot of how these components are working together. I tried to kind of push through the nitty-gritty of setting up Docker a little bit faster so we could really get to the theme components, because that is newer to the presentation. But I will be uploading last week's presentation, which would have more information for the Docker build process and how to actually set up your container. And then in about 2 weeks, I'll have the video documentation as well. Yeah. All right, well, thank you.